Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History, Episode 99, The English and French Revolutions. In this special collaboration with David Crowther of the History of England podcast, we're going to answer your questions on these monumental events. From the similarities and differences to some fantastic hypotheticals, this episode will unpack everything from war to regicide to constitution and religion. So get ready for a wild ride and a few controversial opinions. But because we're history podcasters, David and I do talk a lot, so this episode is going to be split into two parts. However, part 2 will be released next week, and episode 100 will follow as scheduled in 2 weeks' time. That episode will examine the rise of the Committee of Public Safety and the beginning of revolutionary government. Of course, all of this is only possible thanks to the Grey History community. For as little as a coffee or two a month, you can help produce history that isn't black and white and help keep this podcaster off the scaffold. With ad-free listening, bonus content, and a range of other perks, there's every reason to support the show today. So, get your 7-day free trial at patreon.com, and I look forward to welcoming you personally. Now, it's a pleasure to welcome the newest members of the Grey History community. Thank you to the newest virtuous citizens, Patrick and Jarlath, as well as the newest true revolutionary, Alexander. Revolutions also need champions, and in this case, the champions are Eric and the whole country of Luxembourg. While I'm confident that Eric can speak for Eric, I don't know if it's really all of Luxembourg or just someone claiming to represent the will of the people of Luxembourg. Either way, thank you both or all for becoming champions of the people. Naturally, I can't go on without thanking the Pantheon of Heroes, and so I'd like to thank once again Brian, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Kevin S., and Griff. And with that, let's get into this amazing collaboration with the History of England podcast. Two kings, two revolutions, two history podcasters who can't wait to talk about these monumental events. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special Q&A episode between the History of England and the French Revolution and Napoleon podcast. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Will Clark, and I'm the host of the French Revolution and Napoleon by Grey History. And joining me today is the amazing David Crowther of the History of England podcast.
I'm rarely called amazing. In this household, at least, anyway, Will. So thank you for that. And I shall mention it to my wife. Anyway, hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here on the Q&A. It's going to be fun.
It's going to be absolutely brilliant. And for those of you that don't know, David has just finished covering the English Revolution. And so we thought, what better time than to sit down and compare these world-changing events? A few months ago, we asked for listener questions as we prepared for this episode, and as always, you delivered. And so over the next hour or so, we are going to be tackling it all. We're going to be talking about the monarchs, the successes, the failures, the key turning points, and of course, the similarities and differences between these divisive revolutions. Along the way, I'm sure we'll touch on a few controversial opinions, but hopefully everyone still has their heads by the end of it. Now, I think it makes sense to begin with the two men at the center of the action, the monarchs themselves. And David, we had all sorts of questions about Charles I and Louis XVI. So I suppose to start us off, when you think of Charles I, what are his defining characteristics? What makes Charles Charles? And, to quote a contemporary, is this really a tyrant worse than Nero, or do you view him as something else?
Well, you asked me to jump to the end, I suppose. Yes, in says he was a tyrant. We can talk a little bit about how good a tyrant he is when we come to one of the first questions. But more important, I think, is his personal characteristics, what kind of a man he was. And in many ways, he's a very attractive sort of bloke. He's especially following James, who again is a very interesting man, his father, but had a rather louche reputation, it has to be said, if that's the right word, and spent a lot of money and had a rather wild court. His son, Charles, his second son, Charles, was much more austere, much more controlled, was very keen for his court to be a model to the rest of the country, as royal courts were meant to be, as Elizabeth had made sure her court was, actually. The trouble with Charles is he's the perfect second son. I think one of the people who asked a question made the same point. He was never meant to be king. His brother Henry was meant to be king, but his brother was badly behaved enough to go and die, which is thoughtless of him, to be honest. Charles was cultured. He'd made it brilliant. He's a great patron of the arts. He would have been a fantastic second son. I mustn't mention William and Harry here, must I? It's far too contemporary. So we're going to cut that comment that I might possibly have made. So he's got many great qualities. He's a good family man. He doesn't play away. He behaves very well. But he's also arrogant, aloof. He's very personally insecure. If any kind of opposition, he takes as rebellious. He's not good at dealing with people who don't come round to his point of view. He's very inflexible. Throughout these events, he was completely unable to see value in people who opposed him or who ended up maintaining different views from him. And he had slightly odd views. He had a very high opinion of kingship given to him by his father, and crucially, a very high opinion of the divinity, the actual divinity of bishops. This will lead to trouble. One more word. He was, in essence, the perfect martyr. He was brave, courageous, strong set of principles, inflexible. He died very well.
There you go. I think that's a pretty celebratory commentary of Charles I. I think I share similar views about Louis XVI in the sense that I am not as critical of him as perhaps some others are. When I look at Louis XVI, I kind of view him from the perspective of two lenses, the man in private and the man in public. And privately, Louis XVI is warm, he's kind, he's gentle, he's clearly a devoted family man. He's a little introverted. He has a range of quite nerdy hobbies, but as someone who runs a history podcast, I'm not about to throw stones. Yes. I view him...
Can't criticise him for that, can you? Yeah.
No, absolutely not. And the way that I think of Louis XVI is that, if you were being dragged to a family barbecue that you didn't really want to go to, your first question would be, well, is Uncle Louis going to be there? At least he's someone that I can have a chat to and relate with. And, you would find him a perfectly agreeable personality. Unfortunately, Louis XVI is no ordinary uncle, and he's no ordinary person. He is the king of one of the great powers of the 18th century. And in this position, Louis XVI is so out of his depth. He does not have the characteristics required of a monarch, especially of a monarch of a nation like France. He's fickle, he's indecisive, he's unable to make and then unable to hold to those decisions. There is a historian, Edward Lyle, who has a great line. He says that Louis XVI is totally incapable of standing by himself. He leant successively or simultaneously on his aunt, his wife, his ministers, his courtiers, as ready to change his policy as his advisor. And I suppose, in summary, Louis XVI is an absolute monarch without an absolute bone in his body. He is not the person that you want to be running the French state in a crisis, but he would have made a perfectly good small prince or elector in the Holy Roman Empire. And dare I say it, given that at this point in time, you English have Mad King George III, I actually think Louis XVI would have made a great English constitutional monarch at a time when the monarchs were wielding very little real political power.
Poor old George.
Well, poor old Louis as well.
Indeed, poor old Louis.
So, David, one of the questions that we got from listeners was, what if both monarchs had been more ruthless? And for me, when I heard this question for Louis XVI, ruthlessness is not his biggest problem? To me, it's the fact that he's indecisive, he lacks political skill, he has an inability to read the room. A perfect example of this is early on in the revolution. Much like Charles I, he needs to raise taxes, and there's kind of the equivalent of ship money, if you like, where Louis XVI is coming up, or his ministers are coming up with some creative ways to try to raise revenues. And they're kind of forcing taxation reforms through the traditional courts. And needless to say, they're resisting. And on one occasion, Louis XVI actually falls asleep publicly while this is happening. And on another occasion, his cousin, the Duc d'Orléans, challenges this and says, "Is this legal?" And he says, Louis XVI says, "It's legal because I wish it." But then, just to make matters worse, he kind of shrugs his shoulders and says, "Oh, I don't know, you're the master, of course." And so what you have with Louis XVI is a king that, as I said, has no political skill, has no ability to read the room. He's neither respected nor feared. And so, for me, ruthlessness only matters if the king knows what he wants to do and has the means to implement it. And I don't think Louis XVI has that. But I'm curious, Charles I does have a much firmer idea of what he wants and his agenda, and is much more decisive and willing to back ministers. So in the case of Charles, would ruthlessness have made a much bigger difference to his predicament?
I think it would. We are talking about the English Revolution, and I've been a little, a little bit naughty in calling it the English Revolution and a bit stubborn. The Scots call it the Scottish Revolution. I don't see any reason why I shouldn't call it the English Revolution. But it is, of course, the Revolution of Three Kingdoms, and you can't understand the whole thing without understanding the situation in Scotland and in Ireland, because they're all interconnected. So I might argue that, yes, Charles could have been much more ruthless, and I think he could have crushed dissent. A lot of people were on his side. A lot of people believed, actually, that a king could be absolute at the time, believed him when he said that the king's word is law. So he did have a constituency. People had a lot of respect for him because of, what I've said earlier about his personal characteristics. So there are critical occasions. The arrest of the 5 members, for example, if he'd done that much earlier, if he'd really cracked down. Of course, he doesn't have a tool to use. He doesn't have a standing army, as they do in France in the 18th century. So it is much more difficult for him to be ruthless. But I would have said that it is possible that in England, at least, he could have been much more ruthless and closed things down. I doubt he could have done that in Scotland. In Scotland, it was all about religion. And in Scotland, there was such a groundswell behind the National Covenant that I don't think there was anything he could have done except conciliate and not do what he did and try and introduce Laudianism into Scotland. Ireland, again, I don't think ruthlessness would have helped him there, because once it blows off in 1641, it is chaos in Ireland. But what he could have done there has been much more conciliatory. It's a difficult question to answer. My gut feeling is that in England, at least, yes, if he'd been really ruthless, he had enough innate support for him to have scotched this, nipped it in the bud. His problem actually is one more thing on that. His problem is that he's got too much respect for the ancient constitution, ironically. He wants people to see that he's doing things in a legal way, even if he's not being actually legal. So he tries to use forms and ways which are just not decisive and good if you're going to be a Chairman Mao or a ruthless tyrant.
We had another question from a listener that asked, at what point does each monarch lose the ability to use force to create compliance? And it sounds like there, for you, the situation in Ireland and Scotland, perhaps there wasn't a moment for that option to exist. But in England, is there a specific moment that you kind of look at and say that was the opportunity, or perhaps alternatively, a specific moment and you look at that and goes, that's too far, like you've missed your opportunity, as you just said, in the case of the 5 members?
The death of the Earl of Bedford, I think, is the key point. In May 1642, I think I got that right. It has to be said, if he'd reconciled England and if he'd used Bedford's good offices to do that, he'd made key concessions well before Strafford gets executed, then I think he could have raised an English army and maybe he could then have imposed a settlement on Scotland. Cromwell, after all, does the same. and indeed in Ireland, Bedford was a bridge that showed a way to conciliate. And if he'd thrown Strafford to the wolves, as a more ruthless king would have done earlier, if he'd given the concessions that Bedford wanted him to give, he could have done it. But in May 1641, Strafford is executed, Bedford dies, and that is the end of any chance, I think, for reconciliation without force. How's about the French Revolution? What's the situation there?
I think for me, the problem is that Louis XVI, while there is a royal army, it is completely unreliable. And later on, we're going to get into some of the similarities and differences, but France is experiencing all sorts of crises, most noticeably a bankruptcy crisis, which does impact your ability to pay soldiers and kind of, foster loyalty and discipline, as well as other crises as well. And I'm not really sure that Louis XVI, even if you put aside the issue of his personality, was ever in a position where military force was the best option or, to the extent that it was a viable option. I think that there's just too many issues that France is dealing with, and there's such a great need to modernize the regime in some form that military force, it gets very complicated very quickly. And part of the reason why Louis XVI doesn't really try to use military force and then backs off when he does attempt to is that it looks like it will result in a civil war rather than a simple, crushing of dissent.
Yeah. Very good. So basically, our kings were very poor tyrants. They've gone down in history as tyrants. But if they'd been, certainly if Charles had been more brutal, be a better tyrant, Charles, is the message there. I mean, it's a good job he wasn't, obviously, but,
I think compared to the individuals that we associate with tyranny in, say, the 20th century, Louis XVI and Charles, they just don't hold a candle to them.
It's quite an interesting question, actually, because quite a few people call Cromwell a dictator and more of a tyrant than Charles. The word tyrant and dictator are quite often used interchangeably. And I think there's an important distinction to be made. I don't think either Cromwell or Charles were dictators. They simply don't have the tools at their disposal to do that. They don't have the officers of state. They don't have the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy in the 17th century is tiny. It's a few blokes. They don't have the levers. Government depends on local JPs who are unpaid in order to make it work in the 17th century. So neither Cromwell or Charles had any capability to be a dictator, even with an army for Cromwell. But tyrant is about transgressing the rules of the state. And Charles certainly transgresses the rules of the state. Cromwell's in a slightly different situation because they're making up the rules of the state. But yeah, I think there's an important distinction to be made between a tyrant and a dictator.
I think that's fair enough. I mean, I suppose what's interesting, though, is that even though we will make the distinction with the benefit of hindsight, both these men are obviously accused by revolutionaries of being tyrants and are placed on trial for that crime. And we had a great question from one listener about the trial strategies of these two kings. And essentially, what would have occurred if perhaps Charles had used Louis' strategy and vice versa. And Louis' strategy is a little more complicated than Charles, so I might kick off. Louis XVI, he actively engages with his trial. So his trial is conducted by the National Convention, which has been elected by universal male suffrage shortly after the fall of the monarchy to essentially figure out what the constitutional arrangements will be, and it will be the body that brings France its first republican constitution. And so this is not like the rump parliament or anything like that. Universal male suffrage has elected this body only months before. And so Louis doesn't really question the body's right to try him. Instead, he actively engages with the process. He denies his guilt on each kind of article of indictment. He will offer reasoning about how it was the work of his ministers, or that a particular crime was, or a particular accusation was legal, or that a constitution didn't exist for particular things he was being accused of. And actually, this engagement with the process results in Louis XVI getting a lot of sympathy, not only with the public, but actually with the deputies themselves, who are kind of acting as the prosecution, the judges, the jurors, and ultimately the executioners. And so, because Louis engages with this process, the deputies actually vote to give him a legal counsel and give him legal representation. And I think it speaks to how capable that Louis did by himself, that when he gets a legal defense, they essentially just reiterate, maybe slightly more polished, but they essentially just reiterate Louis XVI's talking points. And so obviously it doesn't work for Louis. He still ends up executed. But I think if he were to adopt Charles I's obstructionism, if you like, and refusal to engage in the process, then I don't think it would have earned him any goodwill from the deputies. And if anything, I just think it would have made him worse. It made things worse for him. So if, to the nuts of the question is, how would Louis XVI have gone if that strategy had been reversed? I don't think it would have done him any favours to adopt the strategy of Charles. And I suspect, because he has obviously been reading about the English civil wars, I suspect that Charles's fate is informing his decision in part.
That's really interesting. I'd read that Louis read a biography of Cromwell or a biography of Charles in prison as he was waiting trial. That must have been uplifting for the lad. I think it's fascinating to see what might have been are always a bit difficult, aren't they? Because I don't think there was any chance Charles was ever going to engage with the process. That would have meant denying his very existence for the last few years, to admit that the rebels had a point, to admit that they were honest men, to admit that he could have contributed towards death and chaos, was completely out with his mental facilities. I don't think there's any shadow of doubt that he ever felt he was wrong. So I think it was impossible anyway. But in terms of, and also to do him justice, he had an eye to the long view. He wanted the monarchy to survive, and he did not want to hobble his descendants with any idea that he could accept the legitimacy. And he would never have accepted the legitimacy of a complete vote of all the people, even without the rumpification of Parliament. They had no right to do what they were doing. You could not try a king. And I think Louis makes the same argument, doesn't he, that in terms of all those crimes that he was accused of earlier when he was king, well, you can't accuse me of those, he says, because I was a king. The king is above the law. So if he had argued, I think it could well have been, I don't think he was ever not going to be killed. The army had the bit between the teeth to him. There is a man of blood who betrayed their trust time after time, and he simply could not be trusted. He would simply not live to any commitments he made because he'd proved it over and over again. So I don't think he'd have got off. But it would have been quite interesting because he would have got a lot of support. There was a lot of support anyway. Famously, Anne Fairfax shouts from the crowd, not 1/4 of the people of England. And of course, he could have argued all the points. I'm pretty sure he would have died. It might well have made the royalist cause stronger, but I don't think it would have made a material difference to the trial. He was still, his head was on borrowed time.
No, fair enough. It's interesting. Louis XVI's trial is a little different because there is essentially a violent revolution in Paris which overthrows the monarchy. The revolutionaries that get elected to the National Convention that quite quickly declare a republic and then draft the Republican Constitution, they're in this odd spot where either the king is guilty of treason or they are. And so you end up in this dynamic where Louis XVI is going to be found guilty. As to whether he is going to be executed, there are a variety of factors at play. It's a very close vote. I think you can make the argument that his death is not guaranteed, and there are factors that maybe aren't immediately obvious that I think play into it. For example, at the time of Louis's execution, the now Republican army is scoring unbelievable military success. It will not last long, but that military success, which essentially starts from the moment that the Republic is declared, it does two things. First of all, it reinforces the perception that the court was betraying the nation because the French were losing the war until Louis was removed from power. But it also removes this idea and this argument from some that Louis XVI needs to be kept alive as a bargaining chip, because all of a sudden the French armies are pouring into Belgium, they're pouring into Piedmont, Sardinia, they're scoring tremendous success. Well, these deputies are talking about establishing sister republics in Naples and in Poland. And so why do you need to keep the king alive as a bargaining chip? So there's other factors at play here beyond what maybe immediately come apparent in terms of just like the raw, did he do this and should he be executed?
Yes, it's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, in the end, although I'm a great admirer of the trial of Charles and how hard the English tried to make it legal and tried to make it formal and give it gravitas, in the end, it's as much about politics as it is about law. And Charles could not be trusted, politically speaking, and therefore, whatever the law said, he had to die. So when Louis dies, do you think the death of Charles gives the French revolutionaries the license to do what they do, to kill the aristocracy and ultimately the royal family because of what had happened in England?
I saw this question come in and it was a fascinating question. It makes sense, right? It makes sense that, well, the English killed Charles and therefore the French felt obliged that they had to kill Louis. But I actually think the answer is no. I don't think Charles's execution kind of gives the French a license to kill Louis XVI. And in a weird way, and this is a little counterintuitive, but in a weird way, if anything, I think that had Charles been spared, had he been exiled or banished or some other punishment, I think the French would have been more inclined to execute Louis XVI. And to understand why, we need to look at the vote to condemn Louis XVI. There's a common myth that he is executed by just a single vote. And that's not entirely accurate. There is a simple majority in favour of unconditional execution by one vote. And then there's a large vote in favour of exile or banishment, but there are also votes that are kind of conditional votes on execution. We don't execute them until after the war, or we have a separate debate about clemency or whatever. And so when you actually look at the kind of vote split between execution or not execution, you would need to flip maybe 5% of the deputies, or about 30 votes, to spare Louis. And so the question here really is, does Charles's execution, materially impact that proportion of votes? And because the National Convention is conducting this trial, we have records of all their debates and their speeches. And you can go looking for references to Charles I. And you do see the occasional reference of, well, the English killed Charles and therefore we must kill Louis. But you don't see that as much as you might think. What you see far more of is the English killed Charles, their republic failed. So what are we going to do differently to ensure that we do not end up with a Cromwell-style military dictatorship or a restoration of the monarchy? And the French revolutionaries are steeped in history. They are also aware that the murder of Caesar results not in the restoration of the Roman Republic, but with the Roman Empire. So they are drawing on these historical examples. And so where Charles's trial comes into the trial of Louis XVI is more about what mistakes did they make that we won't make ourselves, and how are we sure that we're not going to make those mistakes? And to finish on this point, because I said at the start, I actually think that if Charles had been banished or exiled, it might have encouraged Louis's execution. Let's take an example where Charles is banished or exiled or something, and you still end up with a military dictatorship, or you still end up with a restored monarchy. I think the lessons that the French would have taken out of that is to kill a monarchy, you must kill the king. That if you want to secure your republic, you need to treat the deposed monarch like any other guilty citizen. And so I think that would have incentivized the French to have executed Louis XVI if Charles had had a lesser punishment, but you still ended up with a restored monarchy or some similar sort of situation by a military dictatorship, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. You keep calling Cromwell a military dictatorship, incidentally. Do they use that word?
They do. They very much consider they consider Cromwell to be a tyrant and a despot and a dictator, yes. So they are very much, and you will use that word in the debates of the trial. Cromwell is referenced, as I said, there are examples from Roman history and the like that they will reference as well.
It's quite interesting that it comes up so much. And certainly the same thing happens in England with the return of the monarchy. The message has spread that Cromwell was, of course, a dictator, that nobody liked him, that he was a tyrant, he had no support and blah, 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 and he was a terrible man. That's very much promulgated after the Restoration. And it takes until the 19th century for people to realise that truth was a little different.
Yes, Cromwell's reputation at the end of the 1700s is not quite the same as it is today. I think, it's that old story that history is written by the victors, and the victors was a restored monarchy and Cromwell suffered for it.
It did indeed, which I think comes up in a couple of questions further down, actually. We should maybe move on to something rather more important than these trivial questions, because, obviously that's what they are, and go to the question, did Marie Antoinette really say, let them eat cake? And is there any truth in the rumour that in actual fact it was really lardy cake she was referring to, which is, of course, a deeply nutritious food?
Yes.
And I can recommend to anybody.
So there's no evidence that Marie Antoinette was saying this at all. The phrase is kind of attributed to her well into the 19th century. So she has been dead for quite some time. The line itself is kind of assigned to an unnamed French princess. But at the time that this publication occurs, Marie Antoinette is not even in France. She is not a French princess. She's a child. So no, Marie Antoinette did not say in any way, shape or form, let them eat cake.
Maybe to try and make a serious point out of all this, that the listener asked about, were anything as tone deaf about the working classes. And of course, we're not on the working classes, etc. But, I take the point. And there was a lot of conversation in the revolutionary period in England in particular, but also to a degree in Scotland, but in de facto, about a world turned upside down and the outrage of the aristocracy that the county committees were being run by ordinary people, merchants and farmers and that sort of thing. Absolute outrage that these people should be so uppity. You can't construct a Marxist edifice around this, as Christopher Hill tried to do, but nonetheless it is still very much there. And in Scotland, very much the middling classes who are now pushing the aristocracy around, which is very unusual for Scotland up to that point, and the aristocracy will take their revenge on that. But another factor is that there's not the same economic imperative around the English revolutions and indeed the British War of Three Kingdoms. They weren't destitute, they weren't starving. The last famine in Britain is a regional one in Cumbria in 1623. So in England, at least, there's no famine. There is, of course, horribly in Ireland and indeed in Scotland, actually, in the 18th century. But there isn't that economic imperative in the way that there is in France.
No, absolutely. And I know that towards the end, we're going to get into where these revolutions have a lot of parallels and where they significantly diverge. And as it relates to the kind of economic crises that France is facing, including crises in hunger and hyperinflation and the like, that is where you do get quite a reasonable difference. But I wonder if now's the time maybe to start with one of the big differences, I suppose, of our revolutions, and that's the matter of religion. And religion isn't that big for the French Revolution, at least initially, but I know that religion is incredibly important when we're discussing the War of the Three Kingdoms and the broader, English Revolution. So I suppose, David, are you able maybe to outline for the benefit of my listeners who would be unfamiliar with religion being such a key cause from the outset, what the kind of situation was as it related to religion as we lead up to the English Revolution?
I can think of nothing I would rather do, Will. Of course, it is going to take me about a couple of hours. So you might want to go off and make yourself a cup of tea, have some lardy cake, whatever, and I advise your listeners to do the same. I will try and keep it as brief as I can, I promise. I know. So I think there are two key background things to remember about religion at the time of James I and the beginning of the reign of Charles I, 1620s. First of all, in 1600, religious diversity and sectarianism was not an issue anymore. Elizabeth and Whitgift had effectively stopped the separatist Puritan element. Catholicism was down to about 3% of the population. For all intents and purposes, the Anglican Church had won, and it was a religious uniformity, which is the dream of every medieval kingdom and was the aim of everybody in Europe too. Because religious diversity meant essentially going against conscience and the word of God. So what Charles does critically is his introduction of Laudianism in the 1620s and 30s destroys that unity. It hacks off Anglicans, but what it does is release separatism and Puritan sectarianism. So one of the key things is we have a lot of religious diversity by the time 1641 comes around. Presbyterianism in Scotland, Presbyterianism in England and a growing group of independents, and of course Catholicism and Protestant settlers from Scotland and England in Ireland. So there's a lot of religious diversity going around, and it's critical. Second point is talk about the fear of papacy. So it's not just about Catholicism. And in fact, Cromwell in particular has no real beef with Catholicism. I'm sure you'll be outraged to hear, in the sense that he befriends a lot of Catholics. He believes personally that everybody should be able to practice their religion as they choose. But the exception for him or everybody in England, essentially, and in Scotland, is that the Pope is the actual Antichrist. It's not just an insult, a casual insult on the Pope. The Pope is actually the Antichrist. And he is all kidding everybody who believes poor Catholics are being fooled by the Pope, who's dragging you to hell. I mean, I find that it is incredible, in today and age, to think that. But that is what they believe. This was a plot. And therefore, priests and the Pope were culpable in fooling the people, Catholics and Protestants alike. The other thing about Catholicism, and this is the last point I make, is not just about religion. As far as they see, the English constitution is perfection, and everywhere in Europe they see Catholic despots. So the advance of Catholicism is also about the end of English liberties. That is all I have to say about the context until we get on to the question.
So I suppose the question then is how important, dare I say I might know the answer to this or what you're about to say, but how important is religion to the English Revolution and the broader War of the Three Kingdoms?
Quite important. Next question. Obviously, critical. I mean, it's obviously very important because it drives the Scottish Revolution, which drives everything. It becomes the engine. So it is critical. It is at least 50%. I don't know how you'd put a figure on it, but it's at least as important as the secular questions. But also those questions are intertwined because, as I say, Catholicism is about the imposition of despotism in their view. It is about the erosion of liberties. Bishops, which Charles gives such weight to, they are part of that despotism because they have a court called the High Commission, and they're telling people exactly what they can and can't do. So the two are intertwined. It's incredibly essential. You cannot understand it without religion. In a sense, it is a struggle between religious uniformity and religious toleration. And under Cromwell, you have a greater degree of toleration than Britain had ever had before.
It is fascinating how the issue of religion just kind of pierces so many other topics as well, because as you say, it's not only should bishops exist, but does the king have a right to appoint them? And then how does that impact his right to do other things, such as raise taxes or appoint royal officials that have nothing to do with religion at all? Like it just kind of finds a way to seep into debates that you would think would be largely secular or civil in nature. All of a sudden, this religious backdrop is kind of hovering over debates that aren't necessarily, they don't come to mind as being really linked to religion, but it turns out it is.
Yeah, very true. Also, so I think, it'd be interesting, the question I suppose that we need to move to is what is the contrast between the role religion played? But I would say one of the differences, it seemed to me, is that debate about uniformity has been solved by the time the French Revolution comes around. Louis XIV has persecuted, killed, forcibly converted or exiled all Protestants. So the amount of religious diversity is tiny. It's no longer an issue. Is that right, or am I jumping to conclusions?
That's more or less correct. So at the time of the French Revolution in 1789, at least 95% of the population is Catholic, probably more. There is a small proportion of Protestants that remain in France, and Louis XVI actually is starting to give them some measure of rights just before the revolution. But as you say, and I suppose this is one of the key differences between our two revolutions, is that religion is not an issue. It's not a discussion point as the French Revolution arrives. The French Revolution, in a nutshell, it is a bankruptcy crisis, and the state cannot meet its expenditure and it needs to raise taxes, and this then opens Pandora's box. And there are a whole bunch of other factors at play, but in a nutshell, why we get the French Revolution when we do is because of a bankruptcy crisis. And religion is just not a discussion point. Where it is a discussion point is things around, well, what rights should the church have in relation to taxation or taxation exemption? What privileges should the church have? But that is part of a broader conversation around the privileges and rights of the nobility and a lack of equality between what we call the third estate, everyday common people, and the privileged orders and the clergy and the nobility. So religion's just not really a discussion point. However, in saying that, while the lack of religion as a cause is a big difference between our two revolutions, a key similarity is that in time, religion will become a key source of both destabilization and radicalization. And essentially what happens, if I really, slim this down into a 30-second headline, is that to solve their bankruptcy crisis, the revolutionaries nationalized church property. And in nationalizing church property to help pay for the expenses of the state, that means that priests, everyday Catholic priests, essentially become public employees. And the moment that they are employees of the state, then the deputies start to go, well, actually, we can reform the church. We can make bishops and priests elected officials. We can curtail bishoprics and administration zones. We can ignore the Pope. We can do a whole bunch of reforms that essentially about half of all priests reject. And this drives a real wedge between the Catholic Church and the French Revolution. And what that means is that those who consider themselves good and sincere Catholics and are listening to the opposition of the Pope, they are driven towards the counter-revolution. A counter-revolution can claim that they are acting on behalf of the true faith and God, and that results in more radical individuals, in particular ultra-radicals in Paris. That pushes them to adopt harsher measures against the clergy, even those members of the clergy that was supporting the revolution. And this becomes a cycle which feeds on itself again and again and again until you end up with a situation like the de-Christianization campaign in late 1793, the closure of churches across the country, curtailment of public worship, and things like extrajudicial killings of priests. Many priests are deported. Other priests don't have the luxury of a trial. There's instances, for example, in Western France of mass drownings of priests that are just carted onto boats and deliberately sunk. And eventually you end up in a situation where you get state-sponsored cults to try to replace what the radicals consider to be the kind of superstition or fanaticism of Catholicism. And so, in a nutshell, religion is not a cause of the French Revolution, but just like the English Revolution, it is a big driver of instability, of destabilization, of radicalization. That is a key similarity, even though they have different starting points.
Which brings us to the next question, I suppose, is how far the respective regimes' religious policies played into the end of the revolutions under Monk and Napoleon. And from what you're saying, would I suggest that Napoleon partly happens because somebody has got to re-establish some sort of stability into all this religious chaos, or am I jumping ahead?
By the time Napoleon rises to power, much of some of these religious issues, the kind of turbulent nature of them, these religious debates become proxy wars amongst the revolutionaries themselves. That has settled down a little bit. So as it relates to Napoleon's rise, what I would say is that the issues and debates around religion, they help to create the environment, the unrest, the dissatisfaction that helps to foster a military coup. Why Napoleon is the person that succeeds is not really due to a religion. He is not at the head of some Catholic uprising that is going to restore the true faith. He is successful because of his military exploits, because of an amazing propaganda machine. He somehow spins Egypt into a victory when it's really quite a disaster. He is personally ambitious. There's a whole bunch of factors that makes Napoleon who he is and why he's successful. And religion is kind of a secondary situation. So it creates the general environment in which someone could seize power. But the fact that Napoleon is the individual that seizes power, there are other factors at play that are far more important than these religious tensions, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think it's similar in England, actually. It's still there. And the Presbyterians, who are the biggest sector apart from the Anglicans, in general, never supported the death of the king. You can't be hard and fast about this because there would have been Presbyterians who were Republicans. There would have been Anglicans who were Republicans. So there's nothing hard and fast, but by and large, the Presbyterians and Anglicans had never accepted the execution of the king, and they hated the chaos of religious toleration that Cromwell and the independents bring in. But what really causes the chaos is the refusal of the Republicans, this new tradition, this new creed, as it were, refused to accept the Constitution, the idea of a single person and a second house, the ancient Constitution revived almost. That really causes the breakup. But religion is obviously still a factor.
So I suppose then on the topic of the ancient Constitution revived, we do have a great question that came in that relates to which revolution came closest to achieving its goals on both a short term and a long term. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, when you look at the English Revolution, how would you evaluate its success, both in its immediate future and then on the longer time frame?
Fascinating question. Of course, one of the big problems is what were the aims that was never stated. And I think a point which I'll probably come back to again and again, a slightly dull way, if I'm honest. English is the first. There's no roadmap. There's no set of political ideas been floating around in the ether as to what they wanted. But essentially, I would say the initial aim of the revolutionaries in England was not to be revolution, was just to restore what they thought of as the ancient constitution and the limits upon the powers of the king that entailed, while Charles's aim was to restore the ancient constitution and the absolute rights of the king that entailed. So it's slightly frustrating. And of course, in the short term, that kind of fails, but it doesn't really. It's in 1688, which is only 30 years later, that all gets restored and there is a limited constitution, which is pretty much exactly, I'd have said, what the revolutionists were trying to impose, limits on the king. You know, it succeeds in a session, and in 1701, the Act of Succession ends the idea of absolute divine hereditary right, because it chooses not the Stuart, it chooses some ancient Hanoverian lady. Parliament decides who succeeds is the outcome of that, not God. It doesn't take long for the revolution to succeed afterwards.
It's fascinating because the French Revolution is very different, and obviously it's very turbulent, and anyone knows anything not only about the French Revolution, but just French history in the 19th century and how many variations of monarchies, empires, republics that you get. I mean, there's a reason why the first French Republic is in 1792, and we're currently on the fifth French Republic. What I would say with the French Revolution is that you kind of need to look at two separate revolutions. There's the initial revolution of 1789 that sees an absolute monarchy become a constitutional monarchy, and then a few years later, a second revolution that sees the constitutional monarchy become a republic. And if I start with the first one, the constitution that gets created and the constitutional kind of regime that gets set up to place limits on Louis XVI, that constitution is in effect for less than a year. So if I'm evaluating the short-term success of these endeavors, they failed pretty miserably. If their goal was to create a constitutional monarchy, it's a disastrous outcome. If I think about the Republican phase, it lasts longer, but it definitely falls well short of the Republic of Virtue that many revolutionaries were aspiring to create, particularly as it is plagued by corruption and internal repression. The Constitution of 1793, the first Republican Constitution, it's never properly implemented, and liberties and freedoms are trampled during the so-called Reign of Terror. So, in the short term, both the initial constitutional monarchy and then the revolution for the Republic, they largely fail their objectives, and I can't describe really either as successful, despite the fact that they are making meaningful and long-lasting reforms in addition to what they're up to. Over the longer term, you can be a lot more generous. Post-1789, the norm becomes constitutional government. Even when the monarchy is restored after Napoleon, there must be a charter. So if you think about, at a high level what the goal was, which was to introduce a constitution for France and to place constitutional limits on the king, over the longer term, that is successful. If I think about the modern Fifth Republic compared to the goals of the First Republic over the longer term, again, there are many objectives that have been achieved. Universal suffrage, separation of church and state, a much larger welfare state and funds for universal education and the like. These are explicit goals from the First Republic. There are still shortcomings, sure, wealth inequality and low political participation in some ways, but over the longer term, I think that you can make the case that some of the key ideas of both the era for constitutional monarchy and the Republican era have been achieved on a long enough time frame.
Yeah, it's interesting, of course. I could give a more complicated answer for England too, actually, about the longer term. If I take on the aims that emerge, the Levellers and the agreement of the people, even the two subsequent constitutions. But I agree. We never go back to republicanism. So that was never achieved. But of course, that wasn't part of the original aims anyway. Yeah. So talking about constitutions then, somebody else also asked an interesting question, which was, which of the various constitutions had the best chance of working, given the limitations of the eras where they were drafted? How does that play out? What do you think about in terms of France?
The problem here is France has so many constitutions. I'm going to stick to the two that I've kind of been referencing. So the initial constitution of 1791, which is for the constitutional monarchy, and then the constitution of 1793, which comes 2 years later for the First Republic.
I mean, that's typical of the French, isn't it?
Yeah.
You just can't, it's typical of the French, all this all over the place, Come on, settle down.
Exactly. Well, the problem is that their first attempt, the constitutional monarchy of 1791, it's a monstrosity. And I've got a whole episode where I just kind of tear into it. But in a nutshell, it is too republican to work for a monarchy, and it's too monarchical to work for a republic. And it is riddled with a high-minded idealism and internal contradictions, and it kind of encourages dysfunction and deadlock in the way that it treats the power of the king, his relationship between him and his ministers and the legislative assembly, the elected assembly. It's also got all sorts of contradictions around the democratic principles which underpin it. Theoretically, this is an age of liberty and equality and all men are born equal, but then they don't turn around and give universal male suffrage. They say, oh yes, all men are equal, but only men that pay a specific amount of taxes should have the right to vote. And this is one of the many issues that you get with this constitution. And I would also point out, because I noted that there was a link here to some of the demands of the Levellers. What happens with the Constitution of 1791 is that the deputies that draft it in the initial National Assembly, they introduce something called the Self-Denying Ordinance. And what that means is that the men who crafted this constitution cannot be elected into the first legislative assembly, and they cannot become ministers of the king after they leave office, at least for a little while. And what that means is that everyone who has just gone through the experience of crafting this constitution cannot actually help to implement the new order. And if you think about it, this is entirely different from, say, the approach that the Americans are taking at the same time, where many of their presidents and cabinet secretaries are founding fathers. And so the Constitution of 1791, as I said, it lasts less than a year. It never had a hope. The Constitution of 1793 on the Republican side, it's actually never implemented because by now we're in the reign of terror and it's too discredited by the time that ends. It's also full of contradictions, especially tensions between direct democracy and representative democracy. It's kind of this weird middle house that's trying to appease Republican moderates to prevent a civil war, as well as Parisian ultra-radicals. And I would say it's more of a statement of principles than a functioning framework. Would it have lasted longer than a year? Would it have beaten the Constitution of 1791? Obviously, we don't know. I think it's likely, but was it a recipe for long-term success? No, it absolutely wasn't. So my answer to this question of which constitutions had the best chance of working, whatever the English were up to, it's got to be better because these constitutions, I know that you go through quite a bit of change yourself on your end, but the constitutions that the French create are just not particularly, as I said, one of them fails after a year. The other one is never actually implemented. I think that says a lot.
It's quite an interesting debate, isn't it? Because, of course, ever since I was on my mother's milk, I was given the idea that the French Revolution established, these fantastic constitutions which were subverted by the tyrant Napoleon, tyrant and bloodthirsty, destroyer of worlds, Napoleon. And it's interesting that your attitude is interesting, that it weren't practical. And one of the interesting things about the Putney debates, actually, is that the way people should look at that is it's an interesting debate. Not only does it have very radical ideas, but actually they're trying to think of how to make it work. So they end up rejecting the idea of universal male suffrage because they thought, well, that's never going to work. In actual fact, you've got to have this thing where people are going to vote if they've got a stake in the country. So it's quite interesting that you're dissing it when, I've always seen it as this, big, fantastic thing that showed us the way forward to modernity. Anyway, there you go. I don't think mother's milk should really come into any podcast on history, and I'd like to formally apologise for that. Now, where were we? Oh, yes. So we have 3 constitutions. I'll try and be brief. The agreement of the people, which never becomes a constitution. There's nobody to fight for it. It's far too radical. But the exciting thing about it is all these new ideas that have not been around since antiquity, even if then, the idea of natural rights, above and beyond any power of Parliament to change, such as religious toleration, the wider suffrage, all these fantastic ideas. But they're too early. Nobody agrees with all this. Nobody agrees with the idea of equality, that people are in estates and that's the way it is, So it really had no chance of winning, and there was nobody left to fight for it because there are other important things going on. So that was that. Then we get, I've also thought it's very fascinating that though one of the very few countries in the world, I think there are only 3 of us who don't have a written constitution, Britain, has one of the very first written constitutions. There's one earlier one, the Instruments of Government in Sweden, I think, and there may be another one, but basically one of the world's first constitutions, the Instruments of Government of 1653, thoroughly sensible, but it brings back the idea of a single person. And now republicanism have fanatics. The last 4 years have established people now absolutely wedded, like Henry Martin, to the idea of a republic, no single person ruled by a council. And they never accept the idea of a single person. So then we get the third, which is the Humble Petition of Advice in 1657, which is the only constitution which has you voted through by Parliament. And that is the ancient constitution without the hereditary sacral principle and with a greater degree of religious toleration. And that had a real chance of succeeding if the damn Republicans, had agreed to compromise and play a longer game. Could have worked. And if Cromwell had lasted longer, could have worked. Doesn't, because that factionalism carries on. So in the end, it doesn't work and we never have a constitution again.
Those damn Republicans, huh?
Damn Republicans say, hey, well, obviously I'm on their side, but, they could have played the longer game. Just wait a little while. The sacral monarchy is gone. Just relax, guys. Well, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the different aims of revolutionary groups and trying to kind of just get that little bit more of what they're after ends up resulting in frameworks that either don't work or can't be implemented or don't have sufficient buy-in from enough of a coalition across society that it can actually kind of bed down and act as a solid foundation. And I suppose this leads us actually really well to the next question, because what we're talking about here is the inability of these revolutionary regimes to implement some of the values that they had championed years before. And we had a question from a listener, and this listener quoted historian David Starkey, who states that revolutions reproduce the worst aspects of the regimes they replace. And the listener wanted to know what are some of the examples from our 2 revolutions where the new regimes replicate the faults of the old or perhaps even exceed them. Do you want to take this one first, David? I mean, I can think of quite a few examples that you might bring to mind in terms of the crimes of Charles I that get replicated in various ways.
It's interesting. I kind of disagree with David Starkey because...
Thank you for listening to episode 99, The English and French Revolutions, Part 1. Part 2 will be out next week, and we'll dive into the similarities and differences of these 2 monumental events. Don't forget to check out The History of England wherever you get your podcasts. But before you go, if you've enjoyed this episode of Grey History, then why not help create more Grey History? I could really use your support to produce history that isn't black and white, and ad-free listening, bonus content, and a range of other perks are just some of the great benefits of supporting the show. For just a coffee or two a month, you can do your part. So please go to patreon.com today, and I look forward to welcoming you personally. As always, thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day. Grey History is brought to you by its amazing community members, including the heroes of the revolution, Brian, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Kevin S., and Griff. Joining the amazing heroes are the fantastic champions of the people, Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Jeff, Ritus, Cameron, Dan, Paul, Susan, Danny, Gordon, Matthew, Sophia, Kevin, Scott, Jersey, Alvaro, Eric, and the whole country of Luxembourg.